The moon hung low that night, swollen, colorless, a coin of bone above the Georgia fields. Crickets hummed in the dark, unaware that something unholy was stirring beneath their rhythm. The dogs were the first to sense it. Their bodies tensed, ears twitching toward the shack where Peter knelt alone, his hands trembling over the torn leather collar that once hung from his neck. It smelled of salt, iron, and humiliation, a scent he had lived with for years. But tonight, under that moon that seemed to watch everything, he whispered something into the dirt, something that would change the course of his life and the memory of this land forever. No one saw the look in his eyes when he rose. Not the others asleep in their cabins, not the overseer who dreamed of power, not even the hounds chained beneath the oak tree, their muscles coiled in uneasy silence. But something ancient and wordless passed through the night, a soundless oath between man and beast. And by dawn, when the first scream split the horizon, the cotton fields were no longer quiet. Before we go deeper into this story, into the choices that made a man into a myth and turned blood into legend, stay till the very end. Because the truth that waited for Peter beneath that midnight moon was something even freedom could not cleanse. The day began with the sound of chains clinking in rhythm with the windmill. Every morning, the same music, iron against wood, a slow song of submission that the fields had learned to hum. Peter rose before dawn as he always did, though sleep had never truly claimed him. The air still held the chill of night, and the damp earth beneath his feet pressed a familiar ache through his bones. He moved quietly, not because anyone had told him to, but because noise had become a kind of danger. Sound drew eyes. Eyes brought pain. Silence, on the other hand, was a kind of armor. The fields stretched endlessly, pale green rows bending under dew, ghosts of fog drifting low over the soil. Somewhere beyond them, the overseer's house stood tall and white, its windows dark, its chimneys breathing smoke. Peter felt the weight of its shadow even from here. He had learned long ago that the sun itself seemed to rise slower over that house, as if afraid to shine on what it hid. He bent to pick up the rusted pail beside the water trough. The wood creaked as he filled it, his reflection rippling in the muddy water. For a brief second, he caught sight of his face, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the cracked lips, the quiet defiance in his eyes that even he pretended not to see. When the overseer's whistle cut through the air, sharp as a blade, Peter didn't flinch. He only set the pail down, wiped the back of his neck, and walked toward the fields with the other men, his heartbeat steady and slow. By mid-morning, the sun had turned cruel. Sweat gathered along his back, soaking into the torn fabric of his shirt. Each movement was automatic. Pluck, bend, toss. The endless ritual of labor that blurred one day into the next. But beneath the repetition, something in him was stirring, the faint pulse of memory. He could almost hear his mother's voice again, singing softly in a language older than chains. A song about rivers and ancestors and the kind of freedom that lived inside the bones. It came to him in fragments, a whisper at the edge of thought, and he hummed it under his breath, low enough that no one else could hear. When the overseer rode past on his horse, Peter's hum turned to silence. The man's boots gleamed. His smile was small and precise, the kind that never reached the eyes. He carried the whip like an ornament, letting it trail in the dust as if it belonged to the air itself. The dogs followed, 3 of them, huge and restless, their bodies carved from muscle and hunger. They sniffed at the wind as they passed Peter, their eyes sharp, wet, curious. One of them, the smallest, a brindled creature with scars on its muzzle, paused and looked up at him for half a breath. Peter didn't look away. He only blinked, slow and deliberate, before lowering his gaze again. It was the first exchange of something that wasn't fear. That night, the air refused to cool. The cabins sweated with heat, every breath thick with the smell of wood and ash. Men and women lay quiet in their corners, their exhaustion deeper than sleep. Peter sat apart from them, his back to the wall, the moonlight spilling through a crack in the boards like a blade across his hand. He held the old leather collar in his lap, the one he'd worn for a season when punishment demanded humiliation. Its edges were cracked, its buckle rusted, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Maybe it was a reminder. Maybe it was a wound he refused to let heal. He traced a finger along the inside of the collar, feeling where his skin had once rubbed it smooth. There were tiny scratches there, faint marks that almost formed letters. His mother had carved them one night before they took her away, whispering something he hadn't understood then. Words don't just live in mouths. They live in things. He closed his eyes now and tried to remember what the symbols meant. But all that came was the sound of the dogs outside, growling softly in their sleep, and the wind moving through the fields like someone breathing. Something inside him broke open then, not loudly, but like ice cracking underfoot. He pressed the collar to his chest and whispered into the dark, a word he had not spoken aloud in years. A word his mother had once said would make the world listen. The syllables trembled out of him, rough and unfamiliar, and the night seemed to pause. Even the insects fell silent for a moment, as though the land itself was waiting. Then came the sound, soft paws against dirt, a low whine, the clink of a chain. One of the hounds had lifted its head outside. Peter held his breath. The animal's shadow crossed the cabin wall, its outline quivering like smoke. It didn't bark. It didn't move closer. It just stood there listening as if the whisper had been meant for it alone. Peter's heart pounded in his throat. He didn't know what he'd called out for. Freedom, revenge, forgiveness. Only that something had answered. When the dog finally turned and padded away into the night, the air in the cabin felt different. Lighter somehow, but charged, as if the world had shifted an inch while no one was watching. He sat there until dawn, the collar still pressed to his chest, the words still burning in his mouth. The sky outside began to bleed pale blue over the fields, and Peter felt the first spark of something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. A dangerous, trembling kind of hope. The next morning, when the overseer's whistle shrieked through the air again, Peter rose slowly, set the collar beneath the floorboards, and whispered once more. This time not to the dirt, but to the dogs still dreaming under the oak, and far across the field. One of them stirred. The morning sun rose sharp and white, carving shadows across the fields like fresh scars. The air carried a strange stillness, the kind that made even the birds hesitant to sing. Peter stood among the other men, the cotton brushing against his fingers, the ache in his shoulders returning like an old friend. He tried to keep his mind empty, to move with the rhythm that dulled the hours. But something felt different today. The world seemed to breathe slower, as if waiting for something to happen. The overseer rode in later than usual. The horse's hooves struck the earth with deliberate weight, the metal of its bit glinting under the sun. His name was Mr. Halbrook, though most had learned not to speak it unless they had to. He was tall, pale, his eyes the color of winter. Power for him was not just about control. It was a kind of religion. Every command, every blow, was an act of worship to the order he believed kept the world clean. The men called him the hand of God when they whispered, though none meant it kindly. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soil. The hounds followed as always, 3 dark shapes circling him like thoughts he couldn't let go of. One of them, the brindled one from the night before, broke away for a second, its eyes flicking toward Peter before returning to its master's side. Halbrook noticed. His head turned sharply. "Peter," he said, his voice smooth and cold, a blade wrapped in silk. "Come here." Every movement in the field stopped. Peter's stomach tightened, but his face stayed still. He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped forward. The air between them felt heavy, swollen with things unsaid. Halbrook studied him for a long moment, his gaze sliding from Peter's face to the faint marks on his neck where the collar used to be. "I heard something last night," he said softly. "One of the dogs was restless." "Growling at your cabin," Peter kept his eyes low. "Could be the wind, sir." Halbrook smiled. A thin, dangerous curve. "Could be." He stepped closer. The leather of his gloves creaked. "But I don't like restless animals, Peter. I like them obedient. Same as men. The whip appeared from his belt like a shadow finding its owner. No one breathed. Even the insects seemed to pause, their hum swallowed by the sound of leather sliding through air. Peter didn't flinch. He had learned that fear only fed men like Halbrook. Still, his hands shook, not from terror, but from something else. The same word that had burned in his throat last night began to echo in the back of his mind. He bit it down. Halbrook struck once across his shoulder. The pain ripped through him, clean and white. A second blow followed, then a third. The world narrowed to sound, the crack of leather, the grunt of breath, the whisper of dirt. He fell to his knees, his palms sinking into the soil that had seen this too many times before. "Look at me," Halbrook said. His boots moved into Peter's line of sight, inches away. "Look, at me." Peter raised his head slowly. His eyes met the overseer's, and for the briefest heartbeat, Halbrook saw something there that unsettled him. Not hatred, not fear, but stillness. The kind that came before a storm. "Good," Halbrook murmured, lowering his whip. "Remember this." He turned back toward the horse, satisfied, but the brindled hound had not moved. It was staring at Peter again, its ears pulled back, a low sound rumbling in its throat. Not aggression, something else. Confusion, recognition. Halbrook yanked the chain. "Heel!" he barked, but the dog hesitated, just long enough for Peter to notice. The overseer struck it across the muzzle. A sharp yelp echoed across the field, cutting through the air like a wound. Peter's heart clenched. The others looked away, pretending not to see. But Peter did see. He saw the way the animal's eyes flickered, the way it stepped back, trembling but silent, its gaze sliding toward him again. When night fell, Peter lay face down on the dirt floor of his cabin, his back aflame, every breath tasting of blood and dust. The moonlight slipped through the cracks in the wall, thin and cold. He could still hear the overseer's words, heavy and echoing. "I like them obedient." He turned onto his side and stared toward the small window. Outside, the same brindled dog sat beneath the oak, its eyes glinting in the dark. The chain was still around its neck, but it wasn't sleeping. It was watching him. Waiting. Peter pressed his palm against the floorboards above where he had hidden the collar. Beneath his hand, the wood felt warm, as if the earth itself remembered what he whispered the night before. He closed his eyes and repeated the word again, softly, each syllable carrying his breath out into the night. The dog raised its head. Its chain rattled once, twice. Then silence. Peter didn't know if the sound that followed was wind or something else. A faint growl, low and rhythmic, echoing from deep within the dark. But for the first time in his life, the sound didn't make him afraid. It made him listen. And somewhere between the beating of his heart and the silence of the fields, Peter began to understand that something inside those dogs, and inside himself, had started to change. By morning, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, heavy clouds sagging low over the fields, pressing down as if the air itself wanted to keep everything buried. The rain hadn't started yet, but you could smell it, that thick, metallic scent that made the skin prickle, a promise of cleansing or ruin. No one could tell which. Peter's back still burned from the lashes, each step a reminder of how thin the line was between living and being broken. Yet there was something strange beneath the pain, an alertness, as though the world had widened overnight. The overseer's dogs were restless again. They barked for no reason, their chains pulling taut as they lunged against the posts. The other men whispered that the hounds could smell ghosts, that someone had stirred the dead. Peter said nothing. He only watched from a distance, his movements slower, more deliberate than before. Every moment seemed to carry weight now, every breath, every shadow. The word he'd whispered into the dirt still lived behind his teeth. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly. It was a key. And somewhere deep down, he could feel the lock beginning to turn. When his work was done that evening, Peter walked toward the cypress grove beyond the fields, where the ground turned soft and the air hung thick with insects. The trees there were older than the plantation, their roots rising like bones from the earth. The others didn't go there after dark. They said the spirits gathered beneath those trees, the ones who hadn't found peace. But Peter wasn't afraid of ghosts. He understood them. He carried one in his chest every day. The memory of his mother came to him as he walked, her hands, dark and calloused, pressing herbs into a cloth, her voice, low and sure, whispering words that shaped the air. She'd always said the world had two languages, one for those who spoke it and one for those who listened. Peter had never fully understood what she meant until now. The night spoke, if you knew how to hear it. The soft creak of branches, the pulse of the wind, even the hush that followed a heartbeat. He knelt by the largest tree, the one that leaned slightly toward the creek, its roots thick and twisted like the fingers of a giant hand. Beneath its shade, the ground felt cool. He pressed his palms into the dirt, feeling the dampness soak into his skin. There was peace there, but also something electric, something alive. He began to dig slowly, using his hands until his nails filled with mud. The earth gave way easily, as if it had been waiting for him. From the shallow pit, he pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the last piece of his mother he had left. He'd buried it years ago, after they took her away for healing a child who wasn't supposed to live. Inside the bundle was a small carved figure, worn smooth from her fingers. A man, or maybe a spirit. The features too faded to tell. Peter wiped the mud away with his thumb, tracing its outline. "She said you keep us whole," he murmured. The sound of his own voice startled him. It had been days since he'd spoken aloud to anyone. His words trembled like the air before a storm. "I don't know if that's still true." The wind shifted. The dogs barked again, distant but urgent, their howls echoing across the fields. Peter looked up. The moon had not yet risen, but the sky had begun to glow faintly behind the clouds. He could hear the faint clink of chains, and beneath it, a deeper sound. A growl, low and rhythmic, pulsing through the soil like a heartbeat. He closed his eyes and whispered the word again, the same one that had burned his lips the night before. This time, he said it with his mother's rhythm, with the weight of the figure in his hand. The sound seemed to sink into the ground, pulled downward by something unseen. The air trembled. The leaves above him rustled though there was no wind. Then the growling stopped. Silence. A silence so complete it rang in his ears. Peter opened his eyes. Between the trees, just beyond the edge of shadow, stood the brindled dog. Its eyes glowed faintly, catching the weak light of the horizon. It didn't move toward him, but it didn't turn away either. It only stood there, its head tilted, breath steady and slow. Peter spoke softly, almost without meaning to. "You remember, don't you? The dog's tail flicked once, not in obedience, not in fear, but in understanding." He stayed there until the first drop of rain struck the back of his hand. Then another. Within seconds, the sky broke open. Water poured down in sheets, soaking him through. He looked up, the rain washing blood from his back, mud from his hands, the world blurring into a single gray wash of motion. The carved figure slipped from his fingers and sank into the mud, but he didn't reach for it. He only watched it disappear, a small shape vanishing into the earth as the rain drowned its edges. When he turned back, the dog was gone. Only the chain's faint clatter echoed across the fields carried by the storm. By the time Peter returned to his cabin, the rain had stopped. Steam rose from the soil, curling like smoke. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the dripping leaves, the faint groan of wood. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. In the corner of the room, just beneath the crack of moonlight spilling through the boards, lay something that hadn't been there before. The old leather collar, muddy but whole, resting on the floor as though it had crawled up from the ground to find him again. Peter stared at it. His breath caught somewhere between fear and reverence. The collar gleamed wet under the moonlight, its buckle glinting faintly. He didn't touch it. Not yet. He only whispered the word one last time before lying down, the sound soft as a prayer and sharp as a blade. And outside, the dogs did not sleep. Morning returned with a bitter stillness, the kind that made every sound feel too sharp. The fields were slick from last night's rain, the dirt clinging heavy to the soles of every foot that crossed it. Peter rose before the others, his shirt still damp, the ache in his back fading into something dull and distant. He moved differently now, slow but certain, as if his body carried instructions the mind hadn't yet caught up to. The collar sat. On the table beside him, cleaned of mud but glistening faintly in the light that slipped through the cracks. He didn't remember washing it, yet there it was, gleaming like a secret waiting to be spoken. Outside, the hounds were restless again. Their chains rattled against the wooden posts, a metallic rhythm that rippled across the morning air. Peter could feel it even before he saw them, the agitation, the hunger. But it wasn't just the kind that came from empty bellies. It was deeper, sharper, a hunger for something that couldn't be named. The overseer had ordered them starved for 2 days now, said they needed sharpening. He wanted their instincts alive, their loyalty absolute. He said a dog that never questions its hunger is a man's best tool. Peter knew better. Hunger made even beasts remember what they truly were. That afternoon, Halbrook sent Peter to the kennels. He called it mercy, letting the wounded slave feed the dogs himself. A reminder that the same creatures who tore flesh at his command could turn on him just as quick. But Halbrook didn't understand what Peter had already begun to see, that the world only obeyed those who listened close enough to its pulse. The kennels sat beneath the old oak tree, where the ground was littered with bones and the smell of damp hay and iron. The dogs stirred as Peter approached, their eyes reflecting the low sun. The brindled one stood apart, its ribs sharp beneath its skin, its muzzle scarred from the whip. Peter crouched, setting down the bucket of scraps. The smell of blood filled the air. He waited, saying nothing. The animals growled softly, circling the edge of the pen, the air thick with their breath. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a strip of cloth torn from the collar. He held it in his palm, the leather darkened by rain and sweat, and whispered that word again. The sound barely reached the air. It moved through the space like a ripple, unseen but alive. The brindled dog stopped first, its head tilting, ears twitching. The others froze. The growls faded, replaced by an eerie quiet, as though the world had swallowed its own voice. Peter placed the strip of leather into the bucket and slid it forward. The brindled dog stepped closer, sniffed once, and began to eat. The others followed, but something in the rhythm of their movement had changed. They didn't fight. They didn't bare their teeth. They waited their turn. When the food was gone, the brindled one looked up again, meeting Peter's eyes. He reached a hand toward it, slow, deliberate. The animal didn't move away. Its breath warmed his skin, rough and steady. He felt the scars along its muzzle under his fingertips, and something inside him shifted. It was the first time in years he had touched another living thing without flinching. Then, from behind, came the sound of boots. "Step away!" Halbrook's voice cut through the air, cold and measured. Peter froze. The overseer stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by sunlight, one hand resting on his pistol. "Did I tell you to touch them?" he asked quietly. "No, sir." "Then why are you?" Peter didn't answer. He lowered his hand, stepping back slowly. The brindled dog growled, a low rumble that made Halbrook's eyes narrow. He walked closer, his boots sinking into the mud, and struck the animal hard with the butt of his gun. The dog yelped, staggering back. Peter's fists clenched before he could stop them. Halbrook saw it. "What's that?" the overseer said, a mocking smile twisting his mouth. You feel sorry for it? He struck the dog again, harder this time. The chain rattled violently. Blood streaked the dirt. Peter's vision blurred with heat, the world collapsing to the sound of the animal's cry. Say it, Halbrook hissed. Say you're nothing. Peter didn't speak. His throat closed around words that no longer belonged to this language. He looked at the dog instead, the eyes wild but aware, and whispered under his breath, not loud enough for Halbrook to hear, the word that seemed to hum beneath his pulse. The dog stilled. Its breathing slowed. Then, before either man could move, it lunged, not at Peter, but at the chain. Teeth sank into iron, snapping the loop clean from the post. The overseer staggered backward, his hand fumbling for the pistol, but the animal didn't attack. It stood between them, hackles raised, its gaze locked on Peter as if awaiting command. Down! Halbrook shouted, voice cracking. The other dogs barked wildly, their chains clattering, but the brindled one didn't move. Peter could see confusion flash across the overseer's face, a flicker of fear, small but real. Get back, Halbrook warned, pointing the pistol now at both of them. Peter stepped closer, slow as breath. The hound's muscles rippled, ready to spring, not in violence, but in defense. It was enough. Halbrook fired into the air, the shot echoing through the fields. The dog flinched. Peter turned and fled before the smoke cleared. He ran until the trees swallowed the world. Branches clawed at his arms, the earth slick beneath his feet. When he finally stopped, gasping in the half-dark, the brindled dog stood at the edge of the clearing, its chest heaving, eyes bright in the fading light. They stared at each other, man and beast, two creatures made to obey, and now unsure what obedience even meant. Peter crouched, whispering that word again, the syllables trembling out of him like breath. The dog tilted its head, then padded forward, pressing its muzzle against his knee. Something ancient passed between them in that moment, an understanding older than language, deeper than blood. It wasn't about vengeance or survival. It was about recognition. As the sun sank behind the trees, the first howl rose over the plantation, long and mournful. It wasn't the cry of hunger anymore. It was the sound of remembering. And for the first time, Peter didn't bow his head when he heard it. Night came like a veil drawn over the earth. The moon hung low and red, caught in the tangle of clouds like a dying ember that refused to fade. Peter moved through the woods in silence, the air wet with the smell of pine and decay, the brindled hound padding at his side. Each step took him farther from the fields, yet he could still feel their weight pressing against the back of his mind. The cries, the chains, the way the overseer's laughter always seemed to echo long after he was gone. The forest had a pulse of its own. Every leaf rustled as though whispering secrets. Every root seemed to twist toward something unseen. The path wound deeper, narrowing between walls of cypress draped in moss. He didn't know where he was going, only that something was guiding him. The same something that had whispered that strange word in his ear, that had woken the dogs, that now hummed faintly in his chest like a remembered song. He stopped when he reached the clearing, a small hollow carved into the earth, where the eye. Moonlight broke through the canopy and painted everything in silver. At its center stood a stone, dark and slick with age, half swallowed by the roots of an ancient tree. It looked less like something made and more like something that had always been there, waiting. The dog circled the stone once, sniffing the ground, then sat. Peter followed its gaze and noticed faint markings carved into the stone's face. Symbols worn nearly smooth by rain and time. They weren't letters, not in any language he knew, but shapes that made his skin prickle. Curves like wounds, spirals like storms. He reached out and traced one with his fingertip. The stone was cold at first, then pulsed faintly under his touch, warm as blood. He drew his hand back sharply. The air shifted. The forest grew still. Even the insects fell silent. Then, slowly, a sound began to rise. Not from the trees or the wind, but from within the earth itself. A deep, trembling hum, like the world exhaling after a long sleep. The dog whined, pressing close against his leg, but didn't flee. And then he saw it. A thin line of light crawling through the cracks of the stone. It spread outward, tracing the carved shapes until the entire surface glowed faintly red, as though something beneath it had been stirred awake. Peter stepped back, heart pounding, and the word came again. Not from his memory this time, but from the very air around him. Whispered, urgent, ancient. He didn't understand it, not fully, but he repeated it anyway. The moment the sound left his mouth, the light surged, washing the clearing in crimson. The hound threw back its head and howled, a sound that shook the branches, sent birds screaming from the treetops. Peter fell to his knees, clutching the earth, as pain lanced through his body like fire and ice at once. Visions flashed behind his eyes. Fields of red earth soaked in rain, men with chains of bone, beasts kneeling beside them, their eyes shining with the same terrible understanding. Then, just as suddenly, the light vanished. Silence returned. The forest breathed again. Peter opened his eyes. The stone was still. The markings no longer glowed, but where his hand had touched, a faint scar now traced his palm, a pattern that matched the carvings. The dog stood before him, panting, its gaze fixed on the mark. It lowered its head, pressing its muzzle to the scar. For a moment, everything in the world narrowed to that single point of contact, and then Peter felt it. The bond. Not of man and beast, not of master and servant, but of something older, something elemental. He could feel the dog's heartbeat, the tension in its muscles, the hunger that wasn't hunger but memory. He saw through its eyes, the fields, the kennels, the chains, the scent of blood on Halbrook's hands. He drew a slow breath, the realization dawning heavy in his chest. Whatever force had called him here wasn't done. It had chosen him. A twig snapped in the distance. Peter turned sharply, instincts alive, and saw movement in the trees. Lanterns, 3 of them, swaying between the trunks. Voices followed, low and sharp. "Search this way," one called. Halbrook's men. Peter looked at the hound. It was already crouched low, silent as shadow, eyes gleaming with purpose. The blood oath had barely been made, and already it demanded its due. He pressed a hand to the dog's flank, whispering the word one last time. The animal tensed, then vanished into the dark like smoke. The men reached the edge of the clearing moments later. Their boots crunched over leaves, their rifles glinting in the faint light. "Spread out," one ordered. "Halbrook says the runaway's in these woods." Peter crouched behind the roots, heart pounding. One of the men knelt beside the stone, running a hand over the carvings. "What's this?" he muttered. "Never seen." The sound cut off. A scream tore through the night, sharp and short, followed by the snapping of branches and the wet sound of tearing flesh. The other 2 men shouted, spinning toward the noise, rifles raised, but the forest had already swallowed it. Then came another scream, closer this time, and then silence again. When the last lantern fell to the ground, its flames sputtering in the mud, Peter stood slowly. The dog emerged from the dark, its muzzle red, eyes alight with something both terrible and beautiful. It padded toward him, silent, unhurried, and stopped at his feet. Peter looked at it, then at the stone, then at the forest now cloaked in stillness. He should have felt horror. He should have felt fear. But what he felt instead was inevitability. The oath had been sealed in blood, as all true ones are. He reached down, touching the dog's head gently, his voice a whisper carried on the wind. Then so it begins. And in the distance, somewhere beyond the trees, the plantation dogs began to howl again, answering a call they had forgotten they knew. By the time the sun rose, the swamp was still. The fog lingered low, curling through the roots like smoke from some invisible fire. Peter walked in silence, the hound at his side, both moving with the patience of ghosts. The air smelled of rain and iron, and the faint light filtering through the canopy made the world seem drained of color, as if dawn itself hesitated to touch this place. He knew they would find the bodies. 3 men torn apart at the edge of the woods. Halbrook would rage. The other slaves would be blamed. Whips would sing again. The world would pretend it didn't understand what had happened. But deep down, the land itself had felt the shift. Something had awakened, and it would not sleep again. Peter reached the edge of the swamp by midday. From the ridge he could see the plantation spread out before him, a sprawling scar of white fences, broken cabins, and fields that shimmered beneath the oppressive sun. The big house rose in the center, pale and gleaming like a tooth in rot. He stood there for a long while, his breath slow and heavy, watching the place that had built and buried him. Everything in him whispered to turn back. Every memory begged him to keep going. He thought of the boy who used to sing in the mornings before the overseer broke his arm for stopping to drink. He thought of the woman who vanished after daring to meet Halbrook's eye. He thought of his mother's voice, trembling when she told him stories of men who could speak to the world and make it listen. "It runs in the blood," she had said once. But blood is a dangerous language. Now he understood what she meant. The word that bound him to the hound still hummed under his skin, faint but constant. A current that would not die. He could sense the other dogs far off, their scent, their breath, their confusion. They were restless, their instincts pulling them toward something they couldn't name. They felt his pulse as he felt theirs. He didn't need chains or commands anymore. The bond was older than obedience. At dusk, he moved again, keeping to the shadows of the trees until he reached the outer fields. The workers had long returned to the quarters, their bodies bent with exhaustion. Smoke drifted from the chimneys, the faint murmur of hymns rising like prayers to a God who always looked away. The overseer's house stood near the kennels, a crude structure of timber and pride. Its door was open, lamplight spilling onto the dirt path like liquid gold. Peter waited until he saw Halbrook step out. The man's face was red from drink, his stride uneven. He carried a whip coiled at his side, even here, even now, as if power was a habit too deep to shed. 2 of the dogs trailed behind him, lean and hungry, their eyes bright in the dark. Peter could smell the bourbon on him even from the trees. He remembered that smell from years ago, the night his back was cut open for the first time, the smell that always came before the pain. Halbrook stopped suddenly, sensing something. His head turned toward the woods, his lips curling. "Who's out there?" he barked. "That you, boy?" Peter didn't move. The air held its breath. Halbrook spat, shook his head and turned away, but the dogs didn't follow. They stood stiff, ears raised, staring into the dark where Peter hid. Their growls were low, uncertain, trembling between fear and recognition. Halbrook snapped his fingers. "Move!" he snarled. The dogs didn't. He turned toward them, whip ready, the leather glinting under the lantern. "You forget who feeds you?" The first sound came before the strike, a low rumble, not from the dogs but from the earth. The sound of roots straining beneath soil, of something old stirring just beneath his feet. Halbrook froze. The dogs turned their heads slowly toward him, their growls deepening. Peter whispered the word again, soft enough that only the trees heard it. The dogs lunged. The scene unfolded in silence, save for the wet rhythm of breath and the whisper of the whip as it fell uselessly to the ground. Halbrook's scream broke too late. Peter stepped from the shadows as the overseer hit the earth, the dogs circling him, eyes burning with that same strange red light that had flickered beneath the stone. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The bond between him and the beasts was language enough. Halbrook reached out, blood slick on his hands. "You," he gasped. "You think this'll change?" His words were swallowed by the dark. When the hounds drew back, there was nothing left of the overseer but stillness and the smell of iron. Peter knelt beside him. The man's eyes were open, fixed on the empty sky. There was no triumph in the moment, only quiet. The revenge that had burned in him for years flickered like a dying flame. He thought it would fill him, but instead it hollowed him out. For a long moment he just sat there, listening to the dogs breathing, to the soft hum of the night around him. Then he looked toward the big house, its white walls glowing faintly under the moon. The master would know by morning. The hunts would begin again, and this time it wouldn't just be dogs they unleashed. He rose, the hound at his side, and walked into the dark. The forest seemed to open for him, branches bending in silence. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Or perhaps it was the sound of hooves, heavy and relentless, echoing across the fields. What began as vengeance was becoming something else. The blood oath had set more than dogs loose that night. It had set history itself moving. And though Peter didn't yet understand it, the cost of what he'd done was already chasing him through the dark. The night held its breath again, waiting for the next turn. Morning came with the smell of smoke. The air was thick with it, clinging to the throats of those who woke before dawn to the distant crackle and the silence that followed. Peter stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the fog, watching as the overseer's house burned. The flames ate through the roof beams first, then the walls, collapsing them into a shower of embers that shimmered in the pale light. The plantation men ran back and forth, shouting orders that dissolved into chaos. The dogs were gone, all but one, his hound. The others had scattered into the swamp, following instincts older than the men who thought they owned them. Halbrook's body hadn't been found yet. But they would. And when they did, Peter knew whose name would be spoken through clenched teeth. He should have fled. He told himself that over and over. Run north, find the others, vanish into the marsh where no white man dared follow. But there was something unfinished here. Something that had been building since the night his mother's blood soaked into this soil. Every step he took away from the fields only drew him back again. Revenge was not a choice now. It was gravity. By noon, the big house was stirring. The master had returned early from Savannah, summoned by word of what had happened. Samuel Wainwright. His name still carried weight beyond the plantation, whispered in town with a kind of fearful respect. He was not cruel like Halbrook, at least not outwardly. His cruelty was quieter, the kind that smiled while tightening a rope. He built his power on the illusion of civility. That illusion was about to break. Peter moved along the tree line, staying low. Through the open fields, he saw Wainwright standing on the veranda, dressed in his Sunday coat despite the heat. His wife hovered behind him, her hands clasped tightly around her rosary. Around them, the remaining slaves were forced to kneel in the dirt, their faces bowed, the fear rolling off them in waves. Peter recognized them all: Elijah, who once taught him how to mend tools in secret; Ruth, whose laughter used to fill the quarters before the years had stolen it; and old Jacob, whose prayers never reached higher than his own heart. Wainwright's voice carried easily. "Halbrook is gone," he said, his tone calm but sharp as glass. "And one of you knows why." He paced slowly before them, the click of his boots cutting through the stillness. "I built this place on order," he continued. "Order that keeps chaos from taking hold. If one man turns against that order, he turns against God himself." No one moved. The only sound was the creak of the porch boards and the faint murmur of fire still dying in the distance. Peter felt his hands tighten into fists. He could see it in Wainwright's face. Not grief, not anger, but insult. The kind of outrage reserved for those who believed the world existed to serve them. A shadow stirred beside him. The hound. It stood poised, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the veranda. It didn't growl this time. It didn't need to. It was waiting for Peter's word. He whispered the syllable again, feeling it vibrate through the air like a thread pulling taut. The hound lowered its body, and Peter moved forward, keeping to the edge of the trees until he could hear the tremor in Wainwright's breath. "Bring the dogs," Wainwright ordered suddenly. "All of them." The handler hesitated. "Sir, they gone mad last night. They ain't coming back." Wainwright turned to him, his face pale with disbelief. "Gone mad?" The man nodded. "They tore the pens apart, vanished into the woods, only tracks and blood left. A flicker of something passed over Wainwright's face, a ripple of unease. But he straightened again, forcing it down. "Then fetch the men," he said. "Search every acre until you find that boy." Peter heard enough. He slipped back into the shadows before the line of men could form. His heart was steady now, not with fear but with the strange calm that comes when there's nothing left to lose. The hound padded beside him as he moved through the trees, circling the plantation, memorizing every face, every movement, every breath. By dusk, rain began to fall. Slow at first, then harder, until the fields turned to rivers of mud. The men abandoned the search, retreating to the barns for shelter. Peter waited until the last lantern was snuffed out, then crossed the open ground toward the house. Each step sank deep into the earth, his breath misting in the cold air. The hound followed close, its fur slick with rain, its eyes twin embers in the dark. He reached the back porch and paused, listening. Somewhere inside, a piano played faintly, a delicate tune, trembling under unsteady fingers. Wainwright's wife. Peter stood there, letting the sound wash over him. It was beautiful in its fragility, that song, as if she too felt the weight of something crumbling around her. Then the melody broke, cut short by a sob. He could hear her whispering prayers. The front door opened suddenly, and Wainwright stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand. He was talking to himself, muttering fragments of scripture like armor. The rain had soaked through his clothes, his hair plastered to his forehead, but still he walked with that same air of ownership, as if the storm itself owed him obedience. Peter stepped out of the dark. For a moment, Wainwright didn't recognize him. He squinted into the rain, lowering the lantern. Then his eyes widened. "You," he said softly. "You should have been gone." Peter didn't answer. The hound growled low beside him, the sound carrying through the storm like thunder. Wainwright stepped back, lifting the lantern higher. "You think you can frighten me?" he hissed. "You think the world will let you—" He never finished. The lantern shattered as it hit the ground, spilling fire across the wet boards. The hound leapt, a blur of motion, and the world erupted into chaos. The crash of glass, the roar of flames, the scream that tore itself from Wainwright's throat. Peter turned away. He didn't need to see. He only listened. To the rain. To the fire. To the last desperate cry that echoed and was swallowed by the storm. And then there was silence. He stood there, the fire reflected in his eyes, the rain hissing as it struck the wood. The big house was burning now, flames crawling up its white pillars, devouring its windows like hungry mouths. The sky above it glowed red, as if the very heavens bore witness. But even as the fire raged, Peter felt no victory. Only a hollow ache, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the emptiness that vengeance could not fill. He had killed the master and the overseer, but the world that made them still breathed. And it would keep breathing long after the ashes cooled. He turned, walking back into the dark, the hound following close behind. Somewhere in the distance, the other dogs began to howl again, not in rage, not in madness, but in mourning. The night swallowed them whole. By dawn, the world was unrecognizable. Smoke lay thick across the horizon, heavy as fog, turning the rising sun into a blood-colored smear. The plantation was no longer a place of order or law, it was ruin. Fields that once shimmered with rows of cotton now burned in uneven patches, black soil glistening beneath the flames. The big house had collapsed into itself overnight, a charred skeleton of columns and ash. Only the iron gate remained standing, twisted and dark, like a monument to everything that once chained them. Peter stood among it all, motionless. The air tasted of soot and memory. His clothes were torn, soaked with rain and blood that wasn't his. Around him, the world seemed to hum with something ancient, a rhythm that matched his pulse. He could feel it moving beneath his feet. The same current that had awakened in the forest. the same voice that had called him under the moon. It had begun as vengeance, yes, but vengeance was too small a word for what this had become. The hound stood beside him, its fur matted and eyes gleaming faintly red in the light. Beyond the fields, shapes moved through the smoke. Other dogs, silent, spectral, their bodies half hidden by mist. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply watched him, waiting. From somewhere in the distance came a sound, not the crack of a whip this time, but the ringing of a bell, the old church bell near the river. It hadn't rung in years, not since the fever took the preacher and half the congregation. Now it rang wildly, unevenly, as if pulled by trembling hands. Peter's heart tightened. Someone was alive out there. He began to walk. The hound followed without command, its gait steady, solemn. Each step through the scorched fields crunched softly, cinders clinging to his boots. As he moved, the landscape changed. Fences melted into earth, the rows of cotton now reduced to charred stubble. The slaves' quarters had been spared the flames, but they stood empty, doors swinging open in the wind. Pots of water overturned, blankets scattered, the ghosts of lives hurriedly abandoned. By the time he reached the river, the bell had stopped. The church stood crooked on its hill, its white paint blistered and flaking, the steeple leaning like an old man's spine. The door was ajar. Inside, faint light flickered from candles set before the altar. And there, kneeling among the pews, was Ruth. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, her hands clasped around a small wooden cross. When she heard the floorboards creak beneath his steps, she turned sharply, eyes wide with fear that softened the instant she recognized him. "Peter," she whispered. "God above, they said you were—" Her voice broke. He didn't answer. He didn't know what he was anymore. Not man, not monster, not savior, something in between. She rose slowly, the cross trembling in her grip. "They're coming," she said. "From the next plantation. They'll kill everyone. They think it was us who set the fire." Peter lowered his gaze. "It was," he said quietly. She stared at him, disbelief and sorrow flickering across her face like lightning over water. "Then what's left, Peter? What's left for any of us now?" He looked past her to the altar, cracked wood, melted wax, the faint echo of a God who had never answered their prayers. "Freedom," he said finally. "Even if it costs everything." Outside, thunder rolled. Or maybe it wasn't thunder. Maybe it was the sound of riders crossing the far field. Men on horseback, rifles gleaming, anger burning hotter than the ruins behind them. Peter could sense them before he saw them, could feel the vibration in the air as the dogs lifted their heads in unison. The hound beside him growled low, the sound vibrating through the church floorboards like a warning. Ruth grabbed his arm. "You can't fight them all." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, all the fury in him faltered. She was the last piece of what he'd been before the blood oath, the last thread tying him to a life he'd already burned. He brushed a thumb across her cheek, leaving a streak of ash. "Then I'll make sure they remember what they did," he said softly. The first gunshot split the air. The bullet tore through the church door, splintering the wood beside his head. Ruth screamed. Peter pushed her down behind the pews as another shot rang out, then another. The hound snarled, bounding toward the open doorway. Peter whispered the word again, the word carved into his palm, and the sound twisted through the air like a command the wind itself obeyed. The dogs outside answered. Their howls rose together, not wild, not frenzied, but deliberate. The sound rolled through the fields, through the trees, through the hearts of the men who thought themselves hunters. Horses reared, the air filled with chaos, shouts, screams, the snapping of reins. Then came the silence, and then the tearing. The kind of sound that made the soul tremble. Peter stood slowly, stepping into the doorway as the rain began again, washing the blood from his hands before it could dry. The hound stood before him, chest heaving, muzzle red. Beyond it, the field stretched out in ruin, dotted with the fallen. The storm had come, and with it, reckoning. Ruth emerged behind him, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the devastation. "What now?" she whispered. Peter turned toward the horizon. The fires were dying now, leaving only smoke and the faint shimmer of dawn. "Now," he said. "The earth remembers." He took one step forward, then another, as the rain thickened, blurring the line between ash and soil. The dogs moved with him, silent shadows, fading into the mist one by one, until only Peter and his hound remained. Together they walked toward the open fields, the ruined fences, and the endless gray sky above. And for a brief moment, just before the world swallowed them whole, it seemed the land itself bowed in silence, mourning, forgiving, or perhaps simply watching as the last echoes of vengeance dissolved into rain. The blood oath had been fulfilled, but its echo would never die. Night fell again, slow and heavy, pressing its weight upon the land like a hand on a wound that refused to close. The storm had passed, but the world was not reborn. It merely slept beneath its scars. Smoke still lingered in the air, mingling with the sweet rot of burned crops and wet earth. Somewhere in the distance, frogs began to sing, their voices weaving through the night like a prayer no god dared to answer. Peter sat by the riverbank, his reflection rippling in the black water. The hound lay beside him, motionless except for the rise and fall of its chest. Its fur was darker now, streaked with soot, but its eyes, those strange, knowing eyes, still burned faintly with the same ember glow. For hours, Peter said nothing. The river spoke for him, whispering over stones, carrying away the remnants of what once was: ash, blood, fragments of cotton. The remnants of a world that had eaten its own heart. He could feel the exhaustion creeping through his bones. His hands trembled when he looked at them, not from weakness but from the realization that they were still human. Somewhere beneath all the horror, beneath the fury that had kept him alive, he was still flesh and breath and memory. That truth was more terrifying than any ghost that might walk the fields. Across the water, a faint light appeared, the flicker of a lantern. For a moment, he thought it might be one of the overseers, come crawling from the ruin like a rat, but then he saw the figure holding it, Ruth. She moved slowly, her dress torn, her hair tangled with rain and soot. The lantern's glow wavered across her face, and in her eyes there was something fragile. Not fear, not pity, but something that looked like grief's quiet sister. Forgiveness. "You should have left," Peter murmured, voice rough as gravel. "I did," she answered softly, stopping a few feet away. "But something brought me back." He looked up at her, the moonlight tracing the hollow of his cheeks, the cut across his temple, the tired defiance in his gaze. "Nothing left to come back to," Ruth shook her head. "There's always something left." For a long while, neither spoke. The night around them seemed to expand, every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. Somewhere an owl cried out, its voice carrying through the cypress trees like an elegy. Ruth knelt beside him, setting the lantern on the ground. Its light reflected in the water, trembling in the current like a second moon. "I saw what you did," she said quietly. "What you became," Peter's jaw tightened. "They made me." "I know," she whispered. "But you didn't have to stay that way." He turned toward her, and for the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only weariness, and something that almost looked like sorrow. "Maybe I don't know how to stop." She reached out and touched his hand. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. The hound lifted its head but did not move. Ruth's fingers were warm despite the chill, her touch gentle, human. And it undid him more than any blade could. He hadn't been touched without violence in years. The simple act broke something open inside him. Her voice trembled. "Then let me help you." Peter's eyes fell to the river again. The current moved faster now, churning with debris, reflecting the broken moon in scattered fragments. "You can't wash away what's been done," he said. "No," she replied, "but maybe we can bury it." The hound rose suddenly, ears pricked. Peter followed its gaze. The tree line. Shapes were moving again, but not men this time. The dogs had returned. Dozens of them, maybe more, emerging from the dark one by one. Some were scarred, some limping, all silent. They gathered along the opposite bank, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight like scattered embers. They didn't advance. They didn't snarl. They only watched, patient, reverent, almost mournful. Peter stood, his shadow stretching long across the water. He could feel their hunger, their confusion, their loyalty. They were bound to him, by blood, by word, by something older than both. He raised a hand, and for the first time he didn't command. He only spoke. "It's done." The dogs lowered their heads, one after another, until the forest itself seemed to bow. Then slowly they turned and vanished into the trees, swallowed by darkness and fog. When the last one disappeared, the night went still again. The spell was broken. Peter sank to his knees, hands pressed into the wet soil. The hound, the first, the faithful, approached and nuzzled his shoulder. He looked into its eyes, saw his own reflection within them. "You're free," he whispered. The hound licked his hand once, then turned and padded into the forest without looking back. Ruth watched in silence, tears tracking down her dirt-streaked face. She knew what it meant. The oath was broken, but it had cost him everything: body, soul, and whatever small piece of peace he might have ever found. The moon rose higher, silver and solemn, bathing the ruins in a light that felt almost merciful. Peter stood slowly, the river glinting behind him like a mirror to another world. He looked toward the horizon, toward the unseen plantations, the unburied dead, the endless expanse of shadowed land, and exhaled. It sounded like surrender, but maybe it was freedom. Ruth stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "What will you do now?" Peter turned to her, eyes hollow yet steady. "Keep walking." And he did. Into the trees, into the mist, into the quiet where no whip could reach and no master's voice could follow. His figure grew smaller, fading until only the faint shimmer of the moonlit water remained. Ruth stood there long after he was gone, holding the lantern until the flame died out. Then, in the hush that followed, she whispered a prayer that no one would ever hear. Not to heaven, not to earth, but to the man who had walked through both and come out the other side. By morning, the fields would be silent again. The overseers dead, the dogs gone, the fire's smoke carried off by the wind. But the people, the ones who had watched and endured, would whisper his name in secret, like a psalm too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Peter of Georgia. The man who turned the master's dogs against him. The one who walked beneath the midnight moon and made it listen.